Nonviolent communication overview. Nonviolent communication is the language of the heart, or in this case, of the self. As discussed throughout this program, we have many parts, and we enter into many states with those parts. And each part and state has its own specific type of language, its own way of filtering the world to try and protect and help you. And since these parts and states are ones that we have learned, they're not necessarily always innate. And since we live in a culture of competition, then we typically have a language of violence. And this language of violence, this language of I'm right, you're wrong, of I have to do this and win, and you have to lose. In that constant competition, in that language of violence, then it might feel natural, right? It might be the most natural thing to think in a certain way, and it might even feel right. And I think that's true until you can access your most authentic and best self. This is also why I have not introduced this concept earlier, because until you can have practice with being able to access your authentic self, then this skill, these tools of nonviolent communication are not going to come in handy, because you have to start with the understanding the difference between the parts and the states that you get into and your authentic self. And the way to do that is to start with understanding, being able to see, accept, and understand yourself first, right? All the different parts of you that want to be heard. If you can give those the time and attention that they need, then it becomes so much easier to do that with people outside of yourself. Because the ultimate step, before we even get into the skills of it, is to be able to access yourself, right? Your soul or your spirit. The place that can feel empathy and warmth and see beyond quote unquote fairness, beyond the states, beyond the parts that take over, so that you can access what you feel from the heart. And that's the most important step. That has to be step 0, right? Before we even get to step 1, that has to be the first thing that you're able to do, is be able to access yourself, your heart. And this is not always easy, especially if you're ingrained in a culture that is all about competition, about right and wrong. And sometimes this type of communication is not necessarily optimal. But in almost all personal relationships and in most other situations, this type of skill can be the language that you choose to use to be able to be your authentic self and communicate as authentically as possible. One giant note before we get started. The goal with nonviolent communication is not to be nice, right? It is not to be nice. That is not the goal. It's not to acquiesce. It's not to deny your desires. It's not to subjugate yourself to others. It's not to pathologize others, and it's not to deny your anger. It's not even a language that requires you to never use force. For example, stopping a kid from running out in the street. You're going to use force. You're not going to talk to them in that moment. And it's definitely not meant for you to try and be perfect with using this communication style, right? You're going to make mistakes with it. The creator of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, has talked about stories when he, the creator of it, who went around teaching this for 50 plus years, would forget it in certain moments. So you're not going to be perfect with it, and the goal is not to be. The goal, though, is to be able to try to access this and be able to use it as often as you can, to be able to communicate clearly and for you to take responsibility over your own feelings. And in doing so, being able to express your highest and most authentic desires. There should be no subjugation towards you, but in the same respect, there should be no guilt-inducing behavior or communication with you towards other people, right? You would do this if you loved me, right? That's guilt-inducing. That is not a choice. You're not giving them a choice in that moment. So you should want for others to genuinely want to do things because they genuinely want to do it. Because simply it would add to their life. And if you can get there, then you can say that you are acting from your most authentic self. And that can be hard, right? When we're used to a culture of competition, of right and wrong, of you doing this and then you're right, or you doing this and you're wrong, it can be hard to change that mindset. This is why we've been working on what your schemas are, or what you want to create, on who you genuinely want to be. This is why we sought first to understand your relationships and the situations that trigger certain emotions in you, so that you would know how to proactively deal with those things. This is where you're proactively choosing how you would want to go into situations, how you will respond, not because it makes sense in a culture of competition, but because it's what your heart, what yourself most desires. And I can't tell you that this is always going to solve your problems, and that's not the goal of this. And I'm not saying you have to or should forgive certain people in your life. All I can say is when you can start to understand your feelings and link those with the needs that you have, and learn to make positive action requests that are actually not demands, then life becomes easier for you. And when that happens, when yourself is in charge, when you can live from your highest values, and you build and practice the skills of nonviolent communication on a consistent basis, then you can find that you're much more effective with your interpersonal relationships. So before we get into the actual skills portion of nonviolent communication, there are 4 questions or 4 steps that we should start with before that. Step 1, can you access yourself? So can you understand what yourself wants from the heart and not overanalyze it in your head? I'm not saying disconnect from your head, but in communication, in personal relationships, if you can't give from the heart, then it's going to be very hard to be cooperative. Of course, you want to remain true to yourself, but you need to be able to cooperate and to understand that other people might have desires that are different than yours. Step 2 is to understand that most communication in a competition culture is a tragic expression of just 2 things, of please and thank you. This means when you hear someone complaining, what they are really asking is please. Please be like this so that I can feel safe to love you. When you hear someone saying, you're so stupid, what they might be saying is, please understand me so that I feel safe, and that when I feel safe, I can feel loved. They're saying, please understand me. But they're saying it in language of, you're so stupid. And the way they do it, by being judgmental, is tragic because it not only leads to defensiveness in the other person, generally, but it also almost always ensures that they will not get what they want or need. It will often lead to the opposite, in fact, of what they want. And even compliments or thank yous can be quote-unquote violent. Someone says, you're such a good person. They generally said this because you did something that in their competitive mindset matches their way of viewing the world. Here it's good, bad, right, wrong. So then the question becomes, what if you did something that doesn't align with their definition of good and bad? Would that make you a bad person then? And this is what we do to kids all the time. We say things like, oh, you're such a good little boy, or you're such a good little girl. But inherent in that thinking is that if I don't like the way you act, then you are wrong and you are bad. And if they are bad when they don't act in a certain way, what are you really saying when you give them that compliment? Are you saying that you won't love them? That they won't be a good person? That they deserve to feel guilt and shame? That they have to hide who they genuinely are because they won't feel accepted around you if they don't? And what does that mean down the road? That that's how they'll see the world and that's how they'll judge other people? And then when we see the world as it is right now, with everyone of their own definition of right and wrong, of good and bad, and in a culture of competition, violently trying to manipulate the other side to do what they want, with lies, deceit, is it ever a wonder why, especially in America, we have this culture of competition that is literally tearing itself apart sometimes? Step 3 is you genuinely have to believe that everything you do and everything that another person does in a relationship with you should only be done because you feel happy to do so, and so does the other person. It has to be a choice with no coercion, no lying, no manipulation, no guilt, no getting a yes even though the person doesn't really want to so that you can feel safe, and no agreeing on your part for things that you genuinely don't want to do. And this can be fucking hard because most of our teaching, like I said, is a culture of competition. Of do this or you're going to get punished. Do this or I'm going to rescind my love. Do this or you're going to fail the grade, right? We have this culture from childhood on where we're forced to be in this culture of competition, where we believe that if we don't do something, the things that we want will never be within our reach. And this pairs with number 4. Step 4 is that you always have a choice, and the choice is always yours. So yes, when children are toddlers and they don't understand the difference between right and wrong, you might have to force them to do certain things. And there are lessons that they have to learn, otherwise they might get hurt and do irreparable harm to themselves. But in smaller interactions, if you're punishing them because they're not acting in the way that you want them to, they have all this energy and you're tired and they want to play, and you are forcing them to sit down, otherwise they're going to get in trouble, then you're teaching them a form of self-denial. That you're teaching them that there's a good way to be and a bad way to be. And what you are ultimately teaching is competition and violence against themselves. That's self-denial. If you want to know why you have so many parts that are hard to configure into yourself, and that you're reacting against the world in certain ways that you don't want, just look at how you were raised. When that happens, you don't empower them to be free. And when it comes to relationships, adult relationships with other humans, the question is, what type of strategies are you using then? Are you using the same types of strategies that you would with a child, that you were taught as a child? Are you happy with the other person finding peace in what they genuinely want and need? Or are you only happy that they match what you want? And so when you look at the Nazis in Germany, how did they lose their humanity? And they lost it by using a language of detachment. It was office speak, right? I'm not the person in charge. I'm just following orders. I have to do this, otherwise I'll get in trouble. So when you take away the language of choice, when you put it on some onus, on something that is out there, when you no longer take responsibility for your choice, even if you don't like the choices that you have, right? It might be, I do this or I die, right? It might be that extreme. Most choices are not that extreme, but just because you don't like the choices available to you does not mean that you don't have a choice. And you see this happening now. It's always happened. This office speak with detachment, especially when it comes to corporations. Corporations destroy the environment. They destroy the natural world. They kill literally hundreds of thousands of people a year between air pollution and other things. But who's responsible? Literally no one. And if no one's responsible, then what happens? Then it's easy to make those choices. Because then it's not you, you're just following company policy. It's a job you have to do, and you need money to survive. It's so hard to get another job. So they destroy the environment, they make money, shareholders make money, and the world goes to shit. And what does that do? It creates more systems of competition. But you have to remember, you always have a choice. Which brings me to the 4 actual steps of nonviolent communication. The first step is observation without judgment. The key here is to be able to express an event that brought up emotions in you without judgment, without criticizing, without bringing your thoughts into it. It's basically something that you can observe in the environment like a picture, right? Like if you were going to take a picture of this and describe it, that's what the observation without judgment is. So you can observe it without evaluating it. For example, you can say, Mike said you were getting on my nerves. That is something that actually happened that you could observe. That is an observation. What wouldn't be an observation is if you said, Mike always gets mad at me, because that would be an evaluation and a judgment. So step 1 is to be able to observe without judgment. 2 is to explain your feelings, which is an emotion or sensation, rather than a thought, which usually brings in the evaluations, again, without blaming the other person. So here, you own your feelings. Your feelings are yours. But feelings can be hard to express because in our culture, we tend to combine feelings with thoughts. For example, you might say, I feel you should know better. That's not a feeling, that's a judgment. Or you might say, I feel like a failure. Again, not a feeling, just a judgment. These tend to be thoughts, evaluations, and judgments, and not feelings. Or you could say, I feel it's useless. Again, that's a thought. One more example from before is, I feel like Mike is manipulative. Again, that's a judgment or evaluation, not a feeling. So the goal is to be able to express those thoughts into feelings. For example, the thought, I feel inadequate as a piano player. Again, this is a thought, not a feeling. So what's the feeling underneath that thought? Expressions of the actual feeling might be, I feel disappointed in myself. Or I feel impatient with myself. Or I feel frustrated with myself. All of those, disappointed, impatient, frustrated, are feelings, things that you feel inside, not thoughts or evaluations. Again, this can be hard because our language tends to combine the two. So with that said, your feelings are actually things that you feel. not judgments, not thoughts. So to continue with the previous example, Mike said, "You're getting on my nerves," which was an observation, which made me feel frustrated, which is you expressing a feeling, because I ... which comes to step 3. Step 3 is expressing your needs. The third step of nonviolent communication is being able to communicate your needs behind your feelings. The more we can connect our feelings, the things that we feel, to our needs that are not being met or are being met, as opposed to another person, the easier it is to stay within yourself, even while you're around others. And when you can do that, when you can combine your feelings with your needs, you can choose to act and respond compassionately as opposed to defensively. Here's a quote taken from the Nonviolent Communication book. "In a world where we are harshly judged for identifying and revealing our needs, doing so can be very frightening, especially for those who are socialized to ignore their own feelings. Women are socialized to ignore their feelings in order to care for others, and men are taught that showing any emotions besides anger is often wrong. The goal with pairing your feelings and needs," which when I say needs are universal needs, right? Like love, caring, connection, understanding, is the ability to develop emotional responsibility. And there are 3 stages that people tend to go through to get to emotional responsibility. One is emotional slavery. Here, we believe that we are responsible for other people's feelings and other people are responsible for how we feel. 2 is the obnoxious stage. Here is where we refuse to admit that we care about what anyone thinks or feels. And 3 is emotional liberation. Here we accept full responsibility for our feelings, but not the feelings of others, while being aware that we can never fully meet our needs at the expense of others. We always will need others to meet our needs. But that doesn't mean that they're responsible for our feelings, or that we're responsible for theirs. Which brings us to being able to express needs. Back to the example. Mike said, "You're getting on my nerves." Observation. Which made me feel frustrated. Feeling. Because I have a need of consideration for my opinions. Here, it's a consideration, not necessarily an understanding. Which leads to step 4. Step 4 is requesting that which would enrich life. If you can get to this place of observation and linking that observation to a feeling and a need of yours without criticizing, without blaming, without putting the onus of responsibility on how you're feeling on someone else, without analyzing or diagnosing the other person, then you'll be in the best position for the other person to actually hear your request as a request. And the key with this is that you have to express what you want in a positive action statement. That doesn't mean positive like in a "I feel good," but in something that you actively want them to do versus something that you don't want them to do. In the example I've been giving, if the person's like, "I don't want you to say that I'm getting on your nerves," the person might be like, "Okay, I can do that." And they might be like, "You're getting on my last nerve." In that situation, that person met the request. But that's not the solution, and that's not what you ultimately want. So a positive action request is something that that person can actively do. What action can they take that would meet and help you to fulfill your needs? And here, if you're using vague or generic language, this can be very hard to do. Again, it has to be a specific thing. An example from the book is where a wife tells her husband, "I want you to let me be me." And he responds, "I do." And she goes, "No, you don't." So when asked to express herself in positive action language, she said, "I want you to give me the freedom to grow and be myself." Again, that's a vague statement. When she finally got to the positive action language, what she wanted and said was, "I want you to smile and say that anything I do is okay." That might not be realistic for him to be able to agree to that, but at least she put it in a positive action request. Something that he could actually do that would help for her to have her needs met. And if you haven't put the two together yet, if you haven't noticed, the skill of asking for what you actually want is also the same skill in unearthing the heart of the story, right? What do you want? So then there's one more step in this, right? It's not an official quote unquote step, but it's a step when asking a positive action request that you have to do after you've made that request. And that is for you to have the person repeat back what they just heard. This helps because oftentimes when you're making a request, what someone else can hear is a demand. And if that's the case, they're not going to be happy about it. Remember, it has to be a choice for the other person. And once you get there, when you've made a positive action request and they've heard it as a request and not a demand, then it only truly is a request when they say no, right? How do you respond when they say no? Do you sulk? Do you get mad? Do you get angry? Do you say you're so stupid? Do you say, why did I even try this? Because if you do any of those, then it wasn't really a request. It was a demand in nice language. So to continue with the example that I've been using, you can say, Mike said, you're getting on my nerves, which made me feel frustrated because I have a need for my opinions to be considered. Would you be willing to list one or two things specifically that led you to say, you're getting on my nerves, so that I can better understand your opinion and ideally we have more connection? Again, that's a positive action request. List one or two things. And although I use this example throughout, in the next video, I'll be talking about how instead of just hearing that, you might have changed that whole dynamic to begin with by hearing their feelings and needs initially. So when he said, you're getting on my nerves, you can interpret that through a lens of nonviolent communication where you're like, so what you're saying is you feel frustrated because this need of yours isn't being met. And when that happens, even if you're wrong, with them, it helps to give them the language of what they need. It removes this judgment of you're getting on my nerves to what do they need? What's their need that's not being met? But that can be hard because you need to start with empathy for the other person. So again, in the next video, I'll be talking about a whole bunch of situations that just knowing these 4 skills can help, but they don't troubleshoot how it actually looks in the real world. If you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to let me know.